Fossil fuels are by definition, according to Science Daily, quote, a general term for the buried combustible geological deposits of organic material that have been converted to crude oil, coal, and natural gas by exposure to heat, pressure in the Earth's crust over hundreds of millions of years, end quote. Renewable resources can effectively replace fossil fuel as the world's primary source of energy, and this global switch can lead to a substantial decrease in climate change. Renewable resources are any form of energy generation that is not entirely depleted when used and can be replenished in a relatively short time frame. The most popular and sustainable of these resources are wind, hydro, and solar. Prior to the 19th century, most energy sources were renewable. For example, harnessing wind for shipping vessels and the use of animals such as horses and dogs to draw one's wares and as modes of transportation. Some people were acutely aware during the rise of fossil fuel that this resource was not perpetually sustainable. In this debate, I will provide the challenges and defenses of renewable energy. First, I will evaluate the data that the removal of fossil fuel will not reduce CO2 emissions as much as hoped, and second, that the removal will unfairly affect low-income areas. After that, I will showcase the defenses of renewable energy. First, that it is more energy efficient and cost efficient, and second, that its use primarily would generate a positive impact on America's international relationship with the rest of the world. Let's begin by looking at the cons and challenges. According to the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in their Science Daily article, quote, removing fossil subsidies will only slightly slow the growth of CO2 emissions, with the result that by 2030, they would only be 1 to 5% lower than if subsidies had been maintained, end quote. The reasoning behind this, according to IIASA researcher Jessica Jules, is that the subsidies generally refer to only oil, gas, and electricity. This means that in some cases, the removal of these could cause an upswing in switching to cheaper, emission-intensive resources, the exact opposite effect of what we want. According to Jules, quote, while these subsidies add to substantial sums of money, the rate per unit of energy is not high enough to have a big impact on global energy demand, end quote. This is because it is cheaper to reduce energy demand than to subsidize fuel with renewable resources. Next, what needs to be considered is that the impact this will have on the poor. According to the same Science Daily article, quote, many fossil fuel subsidies were put in place to help the poor, low-income areas. And despite the fact that most of the money goes to the rich, the poorer you are, the more your household income and budget comes from these subsidies, so their removal would have a much larger impact on daily life, end quote. This is because removing these non-renewable subsidies that the low-income economies were built around will consequently force these communities to return to firewood and charcoal, which will then emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and continue to damage the planet and the health of these individuals. Now that we've discussed the pitfalls facing renewable energy, let's discuss the positive outcomes of the switch. According to the Science Direct article by Rachel Faulkner, quote, renewable energy and energy efficiency avoids many environmental and price velocity concerns associated with continual reliance on fossil fuels. And when paired with new demand responses and grid planning efforts, they can be every bit as reliable, end quote. Returning to its effects on low-income areas, in that same Science Daily article that I previously evaluated, it also points out that, quote, fortunately the highest number of poor people are concentrated in regions that with the removal of subsidies will have the weakest effect on CO2. Removing subsidies in richer oil and gas exporting regions would therefore provide significantly greater emission savings and have a less detrimental impact on the poor. Well-designed policies can achieve subsidy removal without affecting the poor, end quote. Next, to understand the global positive impact, we must look at it through the economic environmental impacts of renewable energy and its global relevance through the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a voluntary United Nations legal agreement that goals are to combat climate change. Quote, keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius and above pre-industrial levels, and for farther pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 Celsius and to increase the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change, and to make financial flow consistent with a low GHG emissions and climate resilient pathway, end quote. The agreement makes economic sense, but it also makes environmental impact. By joining all these global coalitions, we not only create an avenue for substantial reduction in the world's carbon emission, but we also forge and strengthen economic relationships with other countries, and through a fair and open market will stimulate the economies of each nation. In conclusion, in this debate I introduce what renewable energy is and a brief history of it. We went over the pros and cons of renewable energy, and we went over how the drawbacks, such as concepts of how fossil fuel would not reduce CO2 emissions as much as expected, and the economic pitfalls that it would have on the poor. However, we also answer some of these concerns in the pros of renewable energy. I selected this topic because the need to establish a clean environmental future is a belief that I hold strongly myself, and I work to improve in my daily life. The need for a cleaner and healthier environment, according to Science Direct, a build out of clean energy resources will result in significant social, environmental, and economic benefit, end quote. Nevertheless, in the 21st century, the question of switching to more renewable resources is not a question of if, but when. Thank you.